Hello, welcome back to Let's Talk Title with Emerald Coast Title Services. I'm president of ECTS, Dion Moniz.
And I'm Ashley Bowen, the Director of Operations and a licensed title agent.
All right, so welcome back to our Florida contract series. We're going over the residential contracts, which is the FAR and CRSP. This is part 2, and we are starting at section 5 of FAR. This gets into the automatic extension language in case there's force majeure and all that good stuff.
Yes, this paragraph gives us 2 sections in the contract that the contract will automatically extend. There are another couple of places where the contract will automatically extend later on in the contract.
Yeah.
The first situation here is if there's a CFPB reason for the lender's funds not being ready to be available at closing. So if they didn't get their 3-day disclosure out in time, but everything else has to be done. Underwriting has to be done. They have to be fully approved. Then they can be granted this up to 7-day extension. I have never seen this happen in real practice, actually, believe it or not.
Really?
An extension due to
the 3-day
CFP,
disclosure?
I really haven't. And so that's good because people were trying to use this extension for everything. We don't have a survey. We don't have an appraisal. Our loan's not approved. And they were trying to get an extension, and so they clarified it and made it.
Okay, so that's what you meant. You've never seen it used properly. Yeah, they've tried to use it improperly plenty of times.
Yes, but ever since they changed it, I have not actually had to extend the contract due to that. But we have had to just last week extend due to force majeure.
Yes.
And that is when services essential for closings are unavailable, or the unavailability of utilities or insurance. So if we have a named storm in the Gulf and nobody can bind insurance, then luckily the contracts will automatically extend for everybody until you can bind your insurance.
Yep. So as we say, once there's a storm in the box, which is the Gulf Coast or the Gulf of Mexico,
basically.
Then that locks down insurance. So you have to wait for the storm to completely clear out of that area before the gates are reopened and you can bind insurance and then close.
Just last week, we had to have not just the issuance of insurance, but also the property being reappraised or reevaluated post-storm.
Yeah.
Just even though we didn't really get a bad hit here, the appraiser still had to go out and say, yep, it's still standing.
Yeah.
Before we could close.
I didn't think about that. And so this is specific in FAR. CRSP has the language in a different part of the contract, so it's still in there. It's not quite as nicely worded as it is in FAR, but it's still there, so you can rest assured. All right, so that concludes section 5. So now we're on to section 6, which is occupancy and possession. And this is important when there's either a long-term lease in place or the property is under a short-term rental program.
Yes. So the contract states that the seller shall at closing deliver occupancy and possession of the property free of all tenants, future tenancies, etc. Unless this box is checked. So if you have a lease in place, you must check this box saying that the property is subject to lease after closing, or else the seller is in default because they didn't deliver the property clear of all tenants and occupants. It also says that it has to be free of and clear of all trash and broom swept.
So that's
on the closing day.
I like the
it's
broom
important.
swept part. Absolutely. That's why you do the final walkthrough. But it's interesting. So I had a situation where one of our clients didn't check that box. The seller didn't disclose there was a tenant in place until like 3 days before closing. Buyer finds out, buyer's agent calls me, hey, what do we do? And I referenced that. I'm like, well, they can't convey title free of these tenancies or this tenant. And so they're in default. And so you can cancel the contract if they can't get that tenant out in the next 3 days. And I can't remember what they ended up doing. I can't remember if they extended in order
Cash for keys.
Cash for keys, yeah. And that may have been, I think that's what seller did. They basically paid the tenant to leave. Otherwise, they were going to be in default. So that is very important. So, and now if it's a short-term rental now, there's a new rider that goes with this. So you have to check the box, include the rider, and we'll get into the riders in another episode, but there's additional language in there that you have to address if it's under short-term rental.
If it's under a management agreement. But
Yes.
either way, if this property is subject to a lease, short-term or long-term, after closing, then the buyer has the opportunity, I think it's 5 days, to review either the lease or the rental management agreement and
Correct.
approve it. And they can, if they don't like it for any reason at all, they can cancel the contract and get their money back.
Yep, exactly.
Next section is assignability. Either buyer may assign the contract and be released from all liability. The buyer can assign the contract but cannot be released from liability, or the buyer may not assign the contract at all. Most sellers probably would prefer that last one, may not assign the contract at all. But if you listen to our first part of this contract series, I said that sometimes the buyer, if they are buying an investment property and it is financing contingent, they may have these dreams and aspirations of putting the property in their LLC, but once they get through the lending process, the lender says, we can't, we've got to do it in your individual name. If they contracted in the LLC, they need to assign the contract to their individual name. If the contract is not assignable, they may be screwed. And so I like, for that situation, investment and contingent on financing, to make it assignable but not be released from liability. So that way the buyer can do what they need to with the vesting, but they're not going to be released from liability for the seller's purposes.
Yep, exactly. And the default is that it's not assignable.
Right.
Yeah. So if nothing's checked, then it's not assignable.
And I've only had this one time happen, that the seller wanted a way out. You know, we had like seller's remorse, and the buyer needed a stupid amendment to change the name of the buyer, and the seller said, nope, I'm not signing it.
Yeah.
So you may have an asshole seller one day. So just do that to cover your butt.
And when the market's crazy hot, well, it's been a while, but back when it was crazy hot, sellers were looking for any way they could get out.
Yes.
Because they had someone else willing to pay more. And so, so you don't want to give that ability for the seller to say bye-bye. All right, so Section 8, this is important, significant differences between FAR and CRSP. I'm going to try to be clear about it, but actually you're going to check me if I'm not. So obviously Section 8A, if it's a cash transaction, that's pretty simple. So 8B is what matters. You heard Ashley say earlier that you want to make sure you include the loan amount the financed amount under Section 2C. So under 8B, you also want to make sure that you check the appropriate boxes for the type of loan that your buyer needs. If they have to have a VA loan, that needs to be checked. Because if it's not checked and they get approved for FHA but not VA, well, those terms aren't as good. That buyer may not be able to afford an FHA type of loan, but they're stuck. They can't get out under the financing contingency because they didn't say it was contingent upon a VA. So just as important as putting the financed amount, you also need to make sure you check the appropriate boxes for the type of loan that your buyer needs.
Yes, and this gets overlooked quite a bit, but I have seen that happen where the buyer was expecting an FHA, didn't qualify for whatever reason, but did qualify for a conventional, but they didn't want a conventional.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And you also can limit the interest rate too.
I was just going to say, if you need a certain interest rate, put that in as well.
Yeah, I would like to buy a house at no more than 5% interest, please.
Yep. Because I had a situation come up. Buyer's agent calls me and says, hey, there's a financing contingency. My buyer needed, and I can't remember what the actual rates were. He needed a 5% rate, but he got approved for 7%. And buyer's agent was like, my guy can't afford 7%. And they didn't put it in they didn't put it in the blanks. And so unfortunately they couldn't back out under the financing contingency because he was approved for a loan, just not the one he needed. And so he ultimately had to eat his deposit because he couldn't close, because he couldn't afford that loan and couldn't find another lender in time to get him approved. The seller wouldn't extend.
It may be a good idea to, like, before you draft this offer, to like talk to the buyer's lender and find out exactly what terms that you need to be checking here in this section.
Yeah, well, it's always good practice to get your buyer pre-qualified so you have some idea as to what you need to put in that financing section, so you kind of create that box.
Yes, note. Good idea to pre-qualify your buyer.
Yes, always. And it gives the sellers a better comfort level too. If you can show that pre-qual letter to the seller along with the offer to show that, hey, they've already been pre-qualified for this loan. All right, so in FAR now, they use the term loan approval period or loan approval, and then CRSP they still use loan. I'm drawing a blank. Loan commitment. Thank you. So loan commitment is basically where the bank says you're approved for the loan subject to these 20 contingencies that we still have to clear for underwriting. Loan approval is you're clear as long as it appraises, which now under the loan approval period in FAR you also have to have it appraised within the deadline. But the only contingency a loan approval can have in order for it to be a true loan approval is the appraisal. So it basically they have to go through underwriting and be done with underwriting except for the appraisal and say, all right, you're good to go.
On the loan approval period in FAR, it includes the appraisal now, doesn't it?
Yes, that's what I was getting to. So the default loan approval period in FAR is 30 days from the effective date. The default loan commitment deadline in CRSP, it's an alternate deadline. It's the later of 10 days before closing or 30 days from the effective date, if I remember correctly. I'm not looking at it right now, but remember, just keep in mind that you've got to calculate 2 dates under CRSP for the loan commitment deadline, which we don't like that. We like the clear deadline in FAR. So the point is to know that there's a floating deadline in CRSP, whereas there's not in FAR. So yes, under the loan approval period in FAR, you now have to have the appraisal done as well. So that's not a separate deadline anymore like it used to be. Under CRSP, it still is a separate deadline for the appraisal. Because again, loan commitment is still contingent on all these various things, including appraisal. So it is a tighter standard in FAR. You got to get jump through a lot more hoops as the buyer, but you're also going to be more secure in being able to close, because I've seen countless times where a buyer has a loan commitment. They think they're good under CRSP, so they let the contract go hard only for something to get rejected in underwriting, and they don't get approved for the loan, and they can't back out. They lose their EMD. Mm-hmm. So it's actually way more protection for the buyer to be under a loan approval period, because then they know that they're going to be able to close and the bank's not going to be able to tell them no at the last minute. So, all right. So we've got loan approval period versus loan commitment deadline for FAR and CRSP. The other significant difference is under FAR, when you get to the loan approval period, that is your deadline to either say, I'm approved, we're moving forward. I'm not approved, give me my money. Or I'm not approved yet, but I think I will be, so I want to move forward under the financing contingency protections. Either way, you have to give notice of one of those three to the seller side by the loan approval period deadline. If you don't do any of those, then it opens up a 3-day window for the seller. So now seller has 3 days to cancel the contract for any reason they want and move on to another buyer. So a loan approval period comes. If there's no notice given by a buyer, seller has a 3-day window to cancel. If seller doesn't do anything within that 3-day window, then the contract goes hard, as we say. The EMD is locked in and both sides have to close. Now, if the seller does cancel within that 3-day window, the buyer gets their EMD. But like I said earlier, if you're in a hot market and the seller is looking for a reason to get out and go to a different buyer, that 3-day window is going to give them that chance. Now, under CRSP, it's just straight up loan commitment period or loan commitment deadline. You have to give one of two different notices. Either I'm not approved, give me back my money, or I am approved, we're moving forward. If you don't do either of those, the contract automatically goes hard. There's no 3-day window for the seller to be able to cancel in CRSP.
Okay.
Is that pretty clear?
Yeah.
All right. So pretty significant differences for the financing section between FAR and CRSP. All right. So.
But then we have.
Oh, we still have the
assumption of an existing mortgage and a seller financing, which would be paragraphs 8C or 8D. We have been seeing a lot more assumptions over the last year. It's assumable loans. Not all of them are. All VA loans are assumable, and those that got the mortgage went out or was taken out in 21 or 22 have really low interest rates. And as those veterans are moving, they have been able to get another veteran to assume that really low interest rate. And that's been so great to see over the last year, those happening.
Yeah.
And then 8D would be seller financing. And I've actually been seeing a lot of that too, because the interest rates have been so high. The seller can hold the note and earn interest off of it. Also, having had sold the house, so they're not responsible for all of the monthly payments and all of that. So it's a pretty good outlet as well.
Yep.
And if you have that type of situation where the seller wants to hold the mortgage on the property, Dion can draft those loan documents, and it's pretty simple. It takes about as much time as a cash transaction. Sellers actually have a lot more benefits than like an actual lender would in the seller financing, like tax sales and stuff. Like the seller held financing is like a super superior to even that type of a lien, which is pretty cool.
Purchase money mortgage.
Mm-hmm. So if you have that type of situation, let us know. We can help you.
Yeah, I actually draft a lot of seller finance stocks
Mm-hmm.
for the title company, and so that is definitely something we can provide as part of our services. It is for a fee because I got to get paid for my legal time on drafting those, but yeah, it is doable,
and it happens fast.
Yes. So one thing I forgot to mention real quick on the financing contingencies is if you're on buyer side, it is very important to get with your buyer a few days before that deadline runs to make sure you have that discussion so that they decide how they want to proceed. Because the last thing you want to do is to let either of those deadlines lapse without having that discussion with your buyer. And now your buyer is losing EMD, and they're going to blame you for it. So be sure that you stay on top of that deadline. All right. So do you think you can cover closing costs in about 3 minutes? All right.
I think so.
So section 9.
All right. So the closing costs. There are some default closing costs here on the contract. The seller is always going to pay for the doc stamps on the deed, the estoppel fees from the HOA, any recording fees for any documents that are needed to cure title, their own attorney fees, and if there's a box in here, paragraph 9C, 1, 2, or 3. You've got 3 options to pick. And so it says like if box C3 is checked, then or C1 is checked, then the seller is going to pay for the owner's policy and charges, which includes the title search and the municipal lien search and the closing fee, title premium, all that. And now the buyer is defaulted to always pay the taxes and recording of the mortgage, all loan expenses, including like the appraisal fees, any inspections that they want to have done, the recording of the deed and the mortgage, the taxes on the mortgage, and then a survey if they need a survey, and then any HOA application fees, transfer fees. And then if paragraph 9C2 is checked, then the buyer would pay for the owner's policy and charges, which includes the title search, the lien search, the closing fee. So it just lays out, here's your default fees. The seller section, because this is it's the residential contract for sale and purchase, it's not as is. So it does give some repair limits. There's 3 boxes there. There's a general repair limit. There's a WDO repair limit. And then there's a permit, closing permit repair limit. It defaults to 1.5% of the purchase price, which can get pretty hefty.
Yeah.
A lot of times people will limit that to like a dollar amount, maybe $1,000 in each section. It is important to know that there are 3 sections for 3 different things. So if you
can stack them.
If you have $1,000 in each bucket and you need to get some appliance stuff repaired, but you also have like some wood rot on the door, well, you can spend up to $1,000 for the repairs, but you also have $1,000 for the wood rot. So it's important to know that you've got these 3 buckets and you can separate your repairs into those 3 buckets.
Yep.
Then when you get to 9C, that's where it talks about the owner's title insurance policy, the lender's policy, and the charges. Here in Okaloosa, Walton counties, Bay, Escambia, Santa Rosa, and the Panhandle, we don't ever have to mess with section 9C3, that's the
Right.
Miami-Dade Broward. Don't even worry about that one. We're just worried about 1 and 2. The seller will pay and choose, or the buyer will pay and choose. Then it says that the buyer will, at the buyer's own expense, pay for a survey to be done. But if the seller has a current survey, the seller shall provide that to the title company. There's a home warranty. You can choose if the seller or the buyer are going to pay for a home warranty, or if no one at all. And then there's a section in here about special assessments. Now, people make mistakes on this section all the time. They constantly think that this is talking about homeowners association
Right.
special assessments, but it doesn't. The second line in this paragraph says public body does not include a condominium or a homeowners association. It's just a public body. It's just like utility liens and stuff.
Exactly.
Very rare for you to ever even have one. You might have one from regional utilities in Walton County, where they changed everything from septic to sewer. But for the most part, it does not have anything to do with a homeowners association special assessment. So I get people all the time saying, well, the seller's got to pay for that special assessment because it says in paragraph 9. And I'm like, no, that's not that same kind of assessment.
That's for the HOA writer. Yeah.
Wrong kind of assessment, buddy.
Yeah. So make sure, depending on what side of the deal you're on, you want to check A or B.
But it does default to seller pays all things that are due before closing, and buyer pays all things that are due after closing. So if it were that special assessment on this sewer pump grinder, it's like $10 a month, and it defaults to where it's your responsibility, and then it's the buyer's responsibility. So
And so one more quick point to make, and then we'll wrap up this episode. But so the standard for Okaloosa Walton, at least, is buyer typically pays title, seller pays dock stamps. Bay County is different. Seller pays both in Bay.
The rest of the state is like that.
Okay, so we're different. We're special.
Yeah, the seller pays everything. The seller pays for the dock stamps on the deed. They also pay for the title, which kind of makes sense because the seller is the one who is trying to convey clear title, and they're proving here this is a policy where it's clear. But I like Okaloosa and Walton County because we're fair and we're splitting costs evenly.
Yes. But just know that if you're on seller side and your seller is within 3 years of when they purchase the property, it might be cheaper to flip it and have seller pay title than buyer pay dock stamps because of what's called a reissue credit. We won't get into that now. Just know that if that's the situation, give Ashley a call. She can run some quotes for you, or you can use our cost calculator and figure it out.
Yes, we'd be happy to run quotes for you. But if you do change the default language in this contract, which is the seller will pay the documentary stamp tax on the deed, then you will need to cross through that and have everybody initial.
Yep. And maybe even specify it under additional terms, just so it's clear.
Yes, the more clear, the better.
Yep. All right, so that's going to do it for part 2 of our residential contracts series. So we'll be right back for part 3. Thank you very much.